Welcome to the Versus History Podcast with your hosts, Patrick O'Shaughnessy, Connell Smith, and Elliot Watson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Versus History Podcast. It's me, your host, Patrick O'Shaughnessy at History Chappie. Thank you very much indeed for joining us yet again. We are now post 140 episodes and we thank you for your ears. Today, we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Peter Bradley, who was the Labour MP for the Wrekin between 1997 and 2005. And more recently, he's co-founded and directed Speakers Corner Trust, a charity which promotes freedom of expression, open debate, and active citizenship in the UK and developing democracies. And he has just written a brand new book, which is out on the 12th of May, 2022. And it's entitled The Last Train, which is a family history of the final solution. Peter, thank you very much indeed for giving up your time to join us on the Versus History Podcast today.
Not at all. I'm really pleased to be here.
The pleasure really is all ours. Please tell us a little bit about you before we get the ball rolling and your background before telling us a little bit about your book.
Well, as you say, I was MP for the Wrekin in the West Midlands from 97 to 2005, one of the Labour intake that came in with Tony Blair. Since then, I, as you say, founded the Speakers Corner Trust, which is a charity that is really trying to promote active citizenship and recognises that a key to that citizenship is debate, open, free debate between citizens. So that's something very close to my heart, particularly close to my heart in the time that I was an MP, and I kind of formed the view that politics is not just about politicians and their policies. It actually, when it works best, when democracy works best, everyone's involved. Democracy is as good as we collectively make it. So that's an important theme, I guess, through my political life, but also in the work we did at Speakers Corner Trust. And actually, it's a fairly important theme in the book that I wrote, having stepped back from.
Well, Peter, interestingly enough, I remember the 1997 general election very well. It's the thing that hooked me into politics. It's one of the reasons I studied it at university. And Speakers Corner, I spent many a Sunday morning, I think, when I was a student in London, popping down there for some free political rhetoric, and enjoyed that very much. So thank you very much indeed for sharing that. Now let's talk about your book. Let's talk about The Last Train, a family history of the final solution. What's it all about and why did you choose to write it?
Well, what it's about is slightly difficult to summarize because I suppose it works on a number of levels, which is kind of mechanically how I wrote it. I didn't set out to write a book, and it kind of grew and grew, and one line of inquiry led to another, and that's why there are various levels. But there was a particular, I suppose, causation of the book itself. While I was still an MP, I wrote a column for a local newspaper, Newport Advertiser, to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day in 2005. And I wrote quite a short article, 700-800 words, the regular kind of MP's monthly column. But it was based on a letter, or the copy of a letter that my father had written to his parents when he first came to this country in the summer of 1939. In the 90s, he wrote a short family history, which didn't go into a great deal of detail, particularly about the Nazi years through which he had lived before he escaped Germany. But to this little history, he appended the letter, quite a long letter, and it's really about his first impressions of life in England, in London in particular, in 1939. And actually, it reads a bit like, I mean, his view of the English was a bit like the Ealing comedies. These were very impressionable perceptions of the English, and quite amusing. I mean, he talks, for example, about how amazed he is, I guess coming from straight-laced Germany, how he was amazed that women smoked in public, that they wore bathing costumes in parks, that men flew kites and pushed prams, and so on and so forth. And kind of amusingly, but also poignantly, he kind of ends his letter by saying to his parents, don't worry about learning English when you come here, because it's really easy. It's particularly easy to strike up a conversation with an English person, for example, on a bus, which I think it was a slightly naive perception of English kind of outgoingness. But anyway, that's what he wrote to them. And he said, you'll be with me soon, I'm sure. But actually, he knew in his heart that they wouldn't be able to join him. And indeed, they weren't able to join him. And so I wrote that article. I think it was perhaps one of my better ones. And it certainly was one of the more meaningful ones that I'd written for the newspapers. And it kind of gestated for a number of years. And gradually, over time, there was an image that emerged from that article, and indeed from the letter that my father wrote. And it was an image of two trains. He says in his family history that he said goodbye to his parents on the platform of Frankfurt South train station on the 10th of May, 1939, as he set out westwards for Channel Coast, Flushing, and then Harwich, and then London. And he travelled and arrived in one day, the 10th of May, which is quite a significant day, because that was the day 65 years later that he died. And it was also the day when he was arrested, or perhaps come on to that, arrested by the British. But that train took him to safety. Another train headed in the opposite direction, headed east to Latvia, and it took my grandparents from their home in Bamberg to the camps around Riga in November 1941. And Latvia is their last resting place. And that's that kind of that tension between those two kind of train movements, one west to freedom, the other east to annihilation, I think is a really significant one, a very symbolic one. That contest between freedom and tyranny. It's a contest that we can see now daily on our TV screens in the struggle that the Ukrainians are waging against an oppressive occupier fighting for their freedom. So I talk about a very small history, the history of my family, but through that history, both in the 20th century and indeed in the centuries that preceded it, I hope that my family history threads through a much longer, a much broader history and illuminates it. So that's, in a sense, is what sparked the idea of the book. This image that would not leave me, if you like, was tugging at my sleeve. And in the end, in order to kind of satisfy that urge, I conceived the idea, I don't fully know why, but that I would follow the train routes that took my grandparents to Latvia. And so I set out to try to trace that route. Frankly, I failed. I was unable, for all the efficiency and record keeping of the Germans and the Nazi Germans in particular. There is no, as far as I've discovered, surviving routes that reliably tells me the itinerary of that train. And then, in any event, even if there had been a planned route, it's unlikely that the train would have stuck to it, because there were troop movements going to and from the Eastern Front that would have required it to divert at regular intervals. So it was trying to trace that train journey that my grandparents were forced to take that led me to want to know more about what happened to them, both before they were forced to board that train and indeed after, when they arrived in that. And that question about what happened led me to another more significant, more fundamental question. Why did it happen? Why did my grandparents' neighbors, their former friends, the people who, shopped at their draperies, or people that they said hello to in the street, why did those people put my grandparents on that train to oblivion? So that really was the starting point of the book, and kind of led to the way it developed. Literally, as I researched and wrote it.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, the next question will split into two separate chunks, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. The horrors of the Holocaust. The first part is what caused it. And the second part is what were the key events and consequences of the Holocaust. So 2 parts, causes, then events and consequences, if you wouldn't mind sharing that with us.
Of course, I think one of the really important points I'm trying to make in the book is that anti-Semitism, what in the public imagination, I guess, lay behind the Holocaust, does not strike like a bolt of, out of the blue. It's something that is deeply embedded in European culture, not just the culture of Germany, but the culture, frankly, of most European countries, including our own, including Britain. I mean, I'm not sure whether listeners are fully aware, but the allegation, the accusation made against Jews from the Middle Ages onwards, right up to the modern day, that they engage in the ritual slaughter of Christian children, horrific accusation that has led to countless pogroms, countless persecutions, and many deaths of Jews throughout Europe and down the ages. That accusation actually originates in this country, in England. Actually, it came from Norwich in the 12th century. And listeners may not be aware that this country, England, was the first country to expel its Jewish community en masse in 1290. And it wasn't for 350 odd years that Jews were actually allowed back into England in the time of Oliver Cromwell. And so, interesting, when Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice and conceived this iconic kind of Jewish stereotype, Shylock, when he wrote that play, established that stereotype, it's fairly unlikely that he had ever encountered a Jew in his lifetime, certainly not an English Jew. There simply weren't any in the country. And that, again, tells the story of how deeply ingrained views of Jews, and usually adverse views of Jews, are in our Western culture. But coming back to the specific circumstances which gave rise to the Nazis and subsequently the war and Holocaust, the defeat that the Germans had suffered in the First World War was a true humiliation for a very young but very proud nation. And that sense of shame and that sense of humiliation was very significantly exacerbated by the reparations that the Allies exacted at the Treaty of Versailles, which bore down very heavily on Germans and the German economy. And of course, the economy in the 20s was pretty shaky. And when the Depression came, the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, combined with extraordinary inflation in the German economy, coupled with a real fear of Bolshevism, given that the revolution had only just, in the years straddling the end of the war, First World War, had only just taken place in the Soviet Union, and taken together with the fragility of the democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic, all this calamity of circumstances contributed to the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. The German people, they wanted a restoration of their national pride. They wanted jobs and security. They were vulnerable to the kind of populism that Hitler represented, the simple solutions to very complex problems that he was proposing, the scapegoats that he offered them. And of course, the Jews were first in line as scapegoats. They weren't the only ones, of course. Socialists, communists, trade unionists were amongst the first to be consigned to the concentration camps. People with mental illnesses, disabled, gypsies, they were also on Hitler's target list. But of course, one of the strong arguments that the Nazis used, absolutely no foundation in fact, was that the reason why the Germans had lost the First World War was not because they weren't sufficiently skilled or resolute or courageous soldiers. It was because they'd been stabbed in the back. Been stabbed in the back by people who were not on the front line. They were at home in the big cities making a lot of money out of the misery of Germans, and of course they were Jews. And so, you know, slogans of the Nazis, frankly, translate them into current coinage, were, you know, Germans must take back control, and they must make Germany great again, literally, Deutschland über alles. And so there was this terrible conflagration of causes which precipitated the rise of the Nazis and everything that followed. And for a time, Germans could see that actually they were, you know, finding jobs, that they were finding a certain amount of social security. They were recovering their pride, and you know, inch by inch and yard by yard, they were being seduced by the Nazis and beginning to swallow whole the propaganda that Hitler and Goebbels and others were promoting. And so my case is that the Nazis didn't come to power because Germans are predisposed to anti-Semitism to a greater extent than anybody else is. Anti-Semitism was a byproduct of Nazis, and the Holocaust was not inevitable, but it was the creation of, as I say, this awful concatenation of circumstance. So the second part of your question, you know, about the Holocaust itself, I think people are very familiar with the dreadful images of the camps, whether it's Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, that was famously liberated by the British Richard Willoughby, broadcasting from Bergen-Belsen and showing for the first time the sheer horror of what had happened there. So we know about the gas chambers. We know that 6 million Jews died. I think it's not so very well that before the gas chambers came into operation around about 1942, already about 1.5 million Jews and others had been murdered by bullet. They'd been shot, mostly by the Einsatzgruppen. There were 4 groups, the Einsatzgruppen of SS and others, that followed the German army into Russia when Operation Barbarossa was launched in the summer of 1941. They followed the front line, and their task was very simple. It was to work with local collaborators in rounding up and slaughtering Jews, commissars, all the others on the list that I kind of reeled off a little earlier. And many of them, you know, were shot into mass graves where hundreds of thousands still lie. In the Baltics, where my grandparents had been deported to Latvia, by the end of 1941, in other words, a month before the Wannsee conference outside Berlin, where the details of the final solution were hammered out, the gas chambers was commissioned, between June 41 and the end of that year, 250,000, a quarter of a million Jews had already been murdered in the Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. There were constant arguments, incidentally, going on between the civil administration that was committed to supporting the German war effort and therefore was very keen to use deported and local Jews as slave labor. Constant arguments and friction between them and the SS that was bent on annihilation. And frankly, the SS always won. Yes, there were many Jews who were slave laborers. My grandfather was one of them. But at the moment that a Jew's usefulness expired, so did he.
Thank you for that, Peter. Okay, next question. Your family were German Jews in Nazi Germany, and your book, The Last Train, is the deeply intimate story of what they experienced from your father's arrest in Buchenwald in 1938 to his subsequent departure to the UK, penniless and alone, in 1939. Please, could you tell us more about this aspect of your father's history?
Yes, my father was born and brought up in Bamberg, which is a beautiful medieval city in Upper Franconia, which is part of Bavaria. His father's family had come from Prussia originally, but his father had settled in Bamberg when he married my father's mother, who came from nearby Bayreuth, which of course is famous for the Wagner Theatre and the favourite venue for the Nazis. But so my father was raised in Bamberg. He was very keen to go to university to study. He was a very keen student of sciences at his school. But of course, by the time he graduated from school, it was no longer possible for Jews to attend university. And so, somewhat reluctantly, he agreed to be apprenticed to a large draper business in Frankfurt. Incidentally, is where my mother comes from. My mother's family had lived in Frankfurt since records of the family began in the late 15th century. The patriarch of my mother's family, the Zunz family, a man called Pesach, came from a little town on the Rhine called Zons, from which they derived their name Zunz. And he was one of the very first residents of the Frankfurt ghetto, which opened in 1460, from memory, but he got there about 20 years later. And then 16 generations of my mother's family lived in the ghetto until it was destroyed for the third and final time by fire under bombardment from Napoleon's troops. This time it wasn't rebuilt. So anyway, my father was apprenticed to a firm in Frankfurt. But when Kristallnacht occurred on the 8th, 9th, 10th of November 1938, that was the night of the broken glass. A young Jewish kind of desperado had shot a German diplomat in the embassy in Paris. He was desperately concerned for his parents, who had been deported from Germany to Poland. And he shot this diplomat to try to make a statement of protest. And Goebbels and others used that as the excuse to unleash pogroms all over Germany, when the SA and the Hitlerjugend and others ransacked and razed the ground perhaps as many as 1,000 or more synagogues in Germany and Austria, smashed up German Jewish shops, and attacked Jews on the street. And the day after Kristallnacht, thousands of Jewish men were arrested, ironically, as the Nazis claimed, for their own protection, and herded into concentration camps. My grandfather was in Dachau. He was released after a month, but only in order to force him to sell his shop and the premises to a member of the Nazi Party at a knockdown price. And ironically, that shop in 1944, I think, was one of the very few buildings in Bamberg to have been flattened by Allied bombing, and the young Nazi bought it or acquired it from my grandfather was killed in the rubble. My father was sent to Buchenwald, which is very near Weimar, beautiful city, city of Goethe, Gropius, Schiller, great names of, those who are familiar with German literature and architecture. Buchenwald was an appalling place. He was there for 5 months. He never spoke about it, but I've been able to write a little about it in my book, based on the memoirs of a distant relative. Well, actually, not that distant, a cousin of my mother's, who was in Buchenwald fairly briefly before he managed to escape to the US. He wrote in later life some memoirs. So my father was there for 5 months. He said in his family history that he doesn't know how he came to get a visa to Britain. Some charity in London had got, Jewish charity had got hold of his name. He got a visa, managed to get out. He arrived, as I mentioned earlier, on the 10th of May, 1939. He subsisted on charity because refugees that were admitted to this country were not allowed to work. He tried to join the army. When my mother died, my father died in 2004, my mother in 2010, and when we were clearing the house, we discovered a trunk in a dusty cupboard under the stairs, and in that trunk were 700 letters that my father and mother had exchanged while my father was in the army in India. Also 35 letters that he had received from his parents after he had come to England and they remained trapped in Germany. But also, interestingly, was a newspaper, the Old News Chronicle, and it was folded open at page 7, and there was a story there about a young German who in October 1939 was queuing up outside a recruitment center, anxious to join the British Army. And they interviewed him and he said, "I'm really keen to join the army and show the Nazis what for." And they said that he had been released from the camps. And although they didn't name him, clearly it was my father. Tried to join the army. They rejected him because of his so-called suspect background. And indeed, in May 1940, with the war already on, and the Germans invading France and the lowlands, the instruction went out to round up all German men, starting in the east of England, as enemy aliens, and to hold them in internment camps, initially in the Isle of Man. But then there were some very unfortunate ones who were then shipped away further to Australia and to Canada. My father and my uncle were amongst those who were sent to Canada. The day before their ship set out, another ship, the Arandora Star, was torpedoed mid-Atlantic, or actually off the north coast of Scotland, on its way to Canada, and hundreds of those who were held aboard, Jewish refugees, Italians, Nazis, German prisoners of war lost their lives, as well as British crew members. My father would have known that when he boarded the Ettrick, which followed in its wake a day later. He did make it safely to Canada. And there, alongside many other young Jewish men who were, for the most part, desperate to join the British Army and fight the Nazis, he was held in a camp in Canada alongside Nazis, alongside German prisoners of war. Must have been not only uncomfortable, but pretty humiliating too. Until finally it was recognised that this was a foolhardy policy on the British. Actually, the reason why they'd been sent to Australia and Canada was extraordinary. The British actually learned fairly early on that the vast majority of people that they had interned were not a threat to Britain, and they began to release them. But they'd already negotiated deals with the Australian and Canadian governments to take shiploads of these so-called enemy aliens, and not wanting to lose face, they'd sent these ships off anyway. Because there weren't enough Nazis and prisoners of war to fill the ships, they kind of added the innocent Jewish refugees into the mix just to fill the berths. That's how ludicrous it was. I mean, I think you can, up to a point, you can understand it. Because, at the beginning of the war, the Nazis were at the Channel Coast. There was a great panic, and to some extent, you have to accept that these things happen, mad though it was. But anyway, he then managed to get back after 2 years to this country, and recruited into the army. And then it was a great disappointment to him that rather than being sent off to Europe, he was sent off to defend the Raj, and spent another 2 years twiddling his thumbs in India. So that was his story. His parents, of course, were trapped in Germany, and much as I think we should credit the British because my father was saved, I think we do need to recognise, particularly when we're reading every day in the newspapers about the terrible obstacles placed in the way of Ukrainian refugees. This country is requiring to apply for visas and jump through all kinds of ever decreasing circles to qualify, whereas other countries are not requiring them to do that. I think we do need to acknowledge that there are certain poignant similarities between those circumstances and those that obtained in the 30s and the very first part of the war. And it wasn't just Britain, it was the US and just about every other country made it almost impossible for Germans, particularly older Germans, who perhaps could offer no economic benefit to host nations. It made it almost impossible for them to secure visas and to escape. My grandparents tried everything to meet the requirements, but they and hundreds of thousands like them failed. They'd left it too late. My grandfather, in particular, was a German patriot. I mentioned he was born in Prussia. He'd been on the front line in the First World War. He didn't believe that terrible things in the end would happen to him and people like him. He could see that the Nazis were not well disposed to the Jews, but he couldn't believe that they would go as far as they eventually did. By the time it was clear that their intentions were as evil as they turned out to be, it was too late. His wife and all her family from Bayreuth were trapped, and in the end, there was no escape for them. And they would have had early intimations of that. My grandmother's brother, eldest brother or elder brother, Ernst, a remarkable man. He lived in a town called Mannheim, where he was a civil engineer. He fought in the First War. Well, I say he fought in the First War. He was an officer in the German army in the First War. He was on the front line. He was wounded. He was awarded the Iron Cross, but he managed never to fire a shot in anger because he was a pacifist. Most extraordinary man. He refused to take the pension that was due to him because of his war injuries, because he thought that there were others far worse off than him who deserved it more. And after Kristallnacht, when the Nazis were rounding up Jews in his town, he was actually exempt because he was a senior member of a Jewish War Veterans Association. But he went nonetheless to show solidarity with his friends and his neighbors. And he was sent by train to a camp in the south of France called Gours. And this was the only westward deportation of Jews in the entire history of the Holocaust. In due course, he was sent from Gours to Drancy outside Paris and Drancy to Auschwitz, from which he didn't return. And it's difficult to know whether my grandparents would have known exactly what happened to him, but news of the deportation did make its way through the grapevine. As much as the Nazis tried to keep these things secret, they would have filtered through, and I think by the end it would be fairly clear to my grandparents what was going on, even as they were boarding the trains from Bamberg to Nuremberg, and then from Nuremberg to Latvia, the Nazis were keeping up the fantasy that they were being, relocated to new territories where they were going to build a life and make their contribution to the German Reich. Some of them, I'm sure, made themselves believe that. Others perhaps were wiser, but clearly that's not what happened when they got to Latvia.
Your studies, Peter, have led you to dig deeply into the origins and enduring potency of an ancient prejudice that still prevails against the Jewish community. Could you perhaps elaborate on that for our listeners, Peter?
Sure. I mentioned that, anti-Semitism doesn't strike out of a clear blue sky, and its roots are very, very deep. In the Christian religion, for example, that there are statements in the New Testament about Jews being, the killers of Christ, which took root, very soon after, in the early Christian era, in the 4th century, in the 300s, when there was a real contest between the early church and the synagogue as to which was going to be the dominant religion. There were Christian propagandists who are very well known, indeed are to this day are saints revered in all Christian churches, the major Christian churches, the Catholic, the Protestant, the Orthodox, who railed in the vilest terms against Jews as demons and idolaters and the murderers of Christ. And their teachings were adopted. They became, received knowledge of Christians across European countries. I mentioned how the blood libel, infamous blood libel, has its origins in this country. But it wasn't just Catholics, and indeed, of course, the Inquisition in medieval Europe had as its target Jews in particular, but obviously others too in Spain and Portugal and elsewhere. But with the Reformation, the leaders of that revolt against Catholicism and the Roman Church, Calvin and Luther, they also wrote the most venomous anti-Jewish tracts. Indeed, Luther wrote one that's 5,000 words long and so outspoken, so full of hatred for the Jews, that it became one of the favorite texts of the Nazis several centuries later. And even with the Enlightenment, think of the intellectual giants like Voltaire, who were anti-clerical, humanists, pro-science, pro-reason, and yet his hatred of the Jews was as venomous as any of those that he opposed. And with the decline of religion in the 19th century, anti-Judaism, anti-Jewishness began to give way to a more pseudo-scientific objection to Jews on a racial. You know, in Christian times, at least Jews could escape persecution. At least they could hope to escape persecution by converting to Christianity. Once the anti-Semites of the 19th century, which formed the kind of so-called intellectual basis for the Nazis, once they determined that actually this was not a matter of faith, it was a matter of blood, of DNA, there was nothing a Jew could do to escape anti-Semitism. Nonetheless, you know, there was nothing that was done to the Jews in the 20th century that hadn't been done to them in every preceding century. The only principle or the difference in the 20th century is the maniacal ambition of the Nazis to eradicate the entire European Jewry, and indeed the technology they had at their disposal to accomplish or seek to accomplish that. But you can see from the strength of hostility to Jews and its persistence over hundreds of years, why it's not surprising that it's still ingrained in our culture. And you know, we're seeing in recent times a resurgence of anti-Semitism in this country and elsewhere. You know, we haven't had time to go into details to the shapes that it takes, but I think it's important that people recognize that this threat is still there. We need to be aware of it. I'm not suggesting for a moment that what happened in the 20th century is likely to reoccur, but it doesn't mean we need to be vigilant, and we need to be particularly vigilant when we see how pretty cynical and ruthless populists seek to excite public animosities for their own benefit, and seek to propose simple solutions to very complex problems. And we've seen in Europe, for example, in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere, how right-wing authoritarian populists, once they get into government, begin gradually to roll back the constitution and the rule of law. And at the same time, we see there and elsewhere how these old, animosities stir themselves again. So we need to be vigilant. We need to protect our democratic values. We need to be aware that they are not inviolable, that we've seen democracies, including the democracy of Weimar Germany, dissolve very quickly when people weren't sufficiently committed to them, weren't sufficiently aware of the temptations that populists offer. So as I say, we need to be informed by history, and we need to understand that actually, ultimately, our future depends on the choices that we make, both as individuals and collectively. That things don't happen because they're bound to happen. They happen either because we want them to happen, or because we don't take care to ensure that they don't happen. And that's perhaps one of the most important lessons, I think, that or messages that I try to convey in my book.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Very, very, very moving, very, very powerful. Now, listeners, if you want to read more, the book by Peter Bradley is entitled The Last Train, A Family History of the Final Solution, and it's published by Harper North, and it will be out on the 12th of May, 2022 in hardback. Peter, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Very, as I said, very powerful and lots to think about there. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your research, as personal as they are. We're really, really grateful for your time.
No, not at all. Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Versus History podcast. Visit us at www.versushistory.com and follow us at Versus History on Twitter and Instagram. You can download all episodes from iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or from wherever you get your podcasts.